Welcome to the Emerging Civil War Podcast. I'm Chris Mikowski, and joining me today is my dear friend and arch nemesis, Rob Orrison. Rob, how are you today?
Doing well, Chris. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well. I've asked Rob to join me today because we're going to go a little farther back in history than we typically do because the America 250 celebration got going, and Rob and our colleagues from Emerging Rev War absolutely rocked their coverage. And I wanted to bring Rob in to talk a little bit about the experience they had in Boston and how we might be able to experience the revolution moving forward as the 250 continues. So you guys had a fantastic time. It was fun watching your videos.
Yeah, it was great. It was something that we had talked about a year ago. Actually something I've been thinking about since I was a kid,
Yeah.
being interested in the American Revolution. But about a year ago, a bunch of us got together and said, we're gonna go up there for the anniversary. It was Easter weekend, which played a little bit havoc on family life back home, but
Oh, yeah.
uh our plan was to start with Paul Revere and his ride from Boston and go all night to Lexington to Concord and follow the fighting and follow the British all the way back to Charlestown in the evening of the 19th. There were some up and down times where if you watch the videos, you'll see there's a couple tired guys on the screen. But once we started getting close to the finish line, our enthusiasm picked back up. It was a great time. And we were talking a lot about Chris about the Civil War 150, which I'm a big Civil War buff as well. And
Yeah.
um, we were trying to compare, the commemorations from the sesquicentennial to this. And it's hard to do because Lexington and Concord, for anyone that's been there, Patriots Day is what they call it, is such a huge community day. I think that was what surprised most of my colleagues. I've been there before, but there's parades, there's thousands of people. Half of them have no idea why they're celebrating April 19th. So it's not really a day of all history. It's kind of like their homecoming. And I mean, there were thousands of people. It was incredible. The weather was great. It was a Saturday, which obviously helped. But it's just amazing to see how these communities commemorate April 19th. And it's actually reinvigorating to think that Americans still care about history, right? Like we always hear that Americans don't care about history. History is dead. The number of young people in their 20s and 30s, and obviously younger school kids that get dragged by the parents, um, was very encouraging. Lots of young people involved and taking in the program. So it was great. We're a little tired now, but it was reinvigorating to see people actually give a darn about what you write about.
Yeah,
As
I
you know
got
how that
several
feels.
several texts from you over the course of your coverage. You're like, dude, I'm on hour 32 with no sleep.
Yeah, we had a couple drinks and a couple cigars to get us through, but mostly Gatorade, I'll be honest.
A little nicotine keep you going there.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I've lived in Maine a lot over the course of my life, and they commemorate Patriots Day in Maine as well. Of course, Maine had been part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony back once upon a time. So, and then everywhere else in the country is like Patriots Day. What's that? So,
Yeah, I
um,
know. But Boston Marathon Day, how's that? If you're not familiar, that Boston Marathon's run on the Monday of the Patriots Day weekend. So the Monday closest to the April 19th holiday is Boston Marathon, which obviously almost everybody knows about the Boston Marathon. So we got out of town right as the marathon started because it gets really crazy in Boston when the marathon kicks off.
Yeah, because traffic is bad enough in Boston, and now let's
Yeah.
shut down a bunch of streets, so we can run the
Yes.
race.
You're right.
Yeah. Now,
You're right.
like as contentious as history can be, and it shows up in the headlines a lot. We see
Sure.
it a lot with Civil War history in particular. But it seems to me that like the founding of the American Republic, all that great stuff with 1775, 1776 growing up, that always just seemed like really inspirational history that was easy to get behind.
Right.
What would your assessment be of that?
Well, it's interesting, kind of add on to that. Um, Down here, I live in Virginia, and we did the St. John's anniversary, which is Patrick Henry's famous speech. There were a lot of protesters there, which I think is, whether you agree with what they're saying or not, it's pretty amazing because what Patrick Henry was doing inside the church was also protesting. So, but I think what we saw up in Massachusetts is. I think we're seeing this, and it can be dangerous. We'll see how it goes. But both sides of the political spectrum are claiming the founders as their own, right? There were a lot of protesters intermixed with the crowd, not loud, not rambunctious, holding signs and stuff like that, no king's tyranny, certain things. But it seems like both sides of the political spectrum are kind of claiming our founders in this current climate. We'll see how that goes as we go through the entire 7 year anniversary cycle. I think also too, Massachusetts is different because if you had gone to Patriots Day 5 years ago, it would have been a big deal, right? Like every year on this day is a big deal. And this was a little bit bigger because it was the 250th and had national spotlight to it. Um, but you're right, as someone that writes the Civil War as well and does a lot of Civil War talks, you find a little bit more, I'm trying to think of the word I'm looking for here, but congeniality when it comes to the American Revolution about the founders that you don't necessarily get when you talk about the American Civil War. I think a lot of that is because we've used the Civil War today to support certain various political causes, and some of the figures can be a little bit controversial, as we all know. When we talk about our founders, it's a little bit different. I think a lot of these communities are named after them. Joseph Warren is mortally wounded at Bunker Hill. Here in Virginia, we have Warrenton, we have Warren County. Joseph Warren never came to Virginia, but we have counties, towns all over the original states and going into the Midwestern states are named after these people. And I think that helps a little bit when we talk about how we remember and how we try to honor and learn about the history of this founding generation. So, I mean, they're complex as well, right? They're complex people. All people are complex. And I think that's the way we should look at it. But you're right, though. There is a different feeling when you study the American Revolution than you do when you get with the Civil War.
And it's funny, because today we can sort of lump the founders together and
Right.
um, and they themselves had really profound disagreements with each
Oh,
other
yeah.
that were often papered over because of the war. But then when the war ends and they start looking at each other like, oh yeah, we don't really understand have a common understanding of what we mean by some of this stuff.
Right.
You know?
Yeah, I mean they had a common enemy, right? At a certain point they had a common enemy, and talking about I know we're kind of going ahead a little bit in the history timeline, but after the war they had to create a government, and that didn't work out originally at first, and they had to create another government, and there were a lot of states that didn't want to do that, and obviously as we all know they kicked the challenge of slavery down the road, which we can always kind of criticize them for. I always like to take the tact that put myself in their shoes. It's a hard decision. I can look back and judge what they should have done, but that's one thing I think will always be a mark that they didn't tackle that issue. But as you know, Chris, the Massachusetts, the John Adams, which I know you're so fond of,
Look,
has a
I have
lot.
my John Adams bust right here. One of
Oh,
my John
I've got
Adams
Jefferson
busts.
somewhere here. I can't find them, but he had a lot in common with, let's say, Jefferson, but they had a lot of differences as well. And they were able, I think the one thing we can learn, hopefully through all this, is they were able to come together. What amazes me, and I think it amazes a lot of people as we talk about the American Revolution, is you have patriots, the Whigs in Massachusetts working with those in Virginia, though they didn't even really know each other that well. And after the Boston Tea Party, and after Parliament passes these acts called we call them the Intolerable Acts today, Virginia's right step in line with Massachusetts, like right with you, we support you 100%. And it's interesting because they had very little in common other than a common threat as they saw it, which was Great Britain. So
Yeah.
I think that's something we can try to hopefully take out of this commemoration over the next couple of years is these people of distant areas, distant beliefs. They were all Christian for the most part, but different Christianity, right? Like Church of England and Baptists, it's a lot different than the Congregational Church in Massachusetts. So they were able to kind of work through those differences and create something that I think personally is still something that's one of the best creations in the history of mankind is, the United States.
Yeah, I agree with that wholeheartedly, and it's neat to be reminded that, despite those vast differences in geography and demographics and religion, that the commonalities were more important than the differences, and they rallied around those commonalities, which I think is a really important lesson to walk away with
And in
here.
time of geographic distance, right? Today, I might not, have a lot in common with someone from India, but I can call them right now, or I can email, or I can. Back then, you sent a letter and you wait a few weeks, right? the fighting at Lexington and Concord, or what we call the Lexington Alarm, happened April 19th and around Boston. News doesn't get here to Virginia until about 10 days later. That's how long it took to get the news. So think about trying to create a common bond among a large group of people over a large geographic disperse is pretty amazing.
Yeah. I want to go back to a comment you made a second ago because I think it really bears examination. And I agree with you on this in that what an extraordinary decision it must have been to decide like keeping the country together and getting it started was more important than dealing with the slavery issue.
Right.
And we have the benefit of seeing like, okay, well, that decision will cost 750,000 lives.
Right.
If they'd have known that outcome, maybe they would have handled it different, but they didn't, and we do. What an extraordinarily difficult decision that must have been it to make that.
Yeah. And also too, just a tag on a little bit of that. Many of these colonies or the states, the Continental Army force that comes under George Washington in June of 1775 is more integrated than any American military force up until the 20th century. African Americans fought on both sides of of the gun here with Great Britain and the colonies, but there was a lot of units in Virginia and Massachusetts. Rhode Island's a big one where they're integrated. And I'm not talking about thousands of African Americans, but they're integrated forces. Prince Esterbrook is on the Lexington Green on April 19th. He's an African American. He gets wounded, he survives, but he's on the green. He's right there with his other white militiamen there on the Lexington Green, April 19th, So I think when you talk about what they were worried about when the war was over, I think a lot of New England states believed that if the slavery issue was a pushed issue, and it wasn't really solved in New England, as you know, right? I mean, slavery was existing in all the colonies at certain points. They were worried they would lose the South and they would break the country up. George Washington had a big fear of that. Um, I think Washington was really fearful that the slavery issue might have broken these states apart. And then he was worried about Great Britain and France and other European countries coming back over here and picking them off to be parts of different countries and not one. So, yeah, long term, obviously, we know what happened. But I think in the time that they were in, especially for Washington and Adams and Jefferson and the other leaders, they thought it was more important to keep these American colonies together. They try to get Quebec, right? We've been trying to get
Yeah.
Canada now for 250 years. Haven't been very successful. Still in the news today, right? But Quebec had other issues. They were more Catholic, so they didn't really have a whole lot in common with the American colonies. But I think their desire to keep together was kind of bigger than trying to deal with this notion of liberty, right? We're arguing for liberty. Liberty for who?
Yeah. Now, since we're talking about Washington, I don't want to get us too far afield from Lexington and Concord. Washington's not there at the time. He does show
Right.
up pretty soon, but he's such a central figure in everything we end up talking about with the Revolution, with the early Republic. I think about when the soldiers during the Civil War are stationed here in the Fredericksburg area. Both sides are trying to sort of claim Washington for their side because we're in Virginia. So the Southerners, of course, see him as a
Right.
Virginian. The
He's on their
Federals, of
seal.
course, see him as, yeah, yeah. So like, tell me just briefly, because this is a whole podcast episode, I'm sure. Like,
I got
how
you.
central is Washington to our whole understanding of the Revolution?
He is the revolution. I mean, I hate saying that. For those who watch us on our podcast and follow us along, me and my friend Mark Malloy in ERW, we argue all the time about Washington. I love George Washington too, but Mark is a huge fanboy in Washington. But he's right in the sense that at a certain point, probably in 1776, Trenton and Princeton time period, Washington's the glue. He's the glue. He's what keeps these colonies together. He's got, not a great military background. He fought in the French Indian War, but not really didn't command large forces, I should say. But one thing Washington will do, and I think this ties into your earlier question about keeping the country together, is he is trying to integrate his army by integration by the states, right? He wants the Continental Army to be an American army, not Virginia regiments, this regiment, this regiment. Even though they're kind of classified that way, he's trying to integrate these forces to make these guys work together, and create an American ethic and an American military force, which he believes will be the kind of the nucleus of a new American society. As the after the war is won, which it was, and these veterans retire and they go back home, the Virginia farmer who was fighting will talk about how he knew these Massachusetts men and these South Carolina men. They have this bond. You see that with what's called the Society of Cincinnati, which is a officer group after the war, a veterans group. But Washington is really the bond that keeps these men together in tough times. Um, doesn't win many battles in the war, which is interesting, but he understands he's got to keep the army in the field and he's got to integrate them. And when I say integration, I don't mean by race. I don't mean by, I mean strictly when talking about keeping these men, these states kind of integrated to make them work together. And he does that very successfully.
And because of that military experience, that gives him a much different perspective on
Right.
nationhood than the rest of the Virginia dynasty does, which is still very parochial and Virginia
Right.
centric. Yeah.
Right, right. And don't ask me what George Washington would have done in 1861 because that's a whole nother three-part podcast.
Yeah.
But just from my opinion, he would have gone for North. But
Yeah. Yeah.
anyways, go.
I think, yeah, that's a great question. I think you would too, but
Yeah.
just because
So
he had
anyway,
that national
send your hate
perspective.
mail to Chris Mikowski, please.
But really, like it was his prestige that
Right.
helped pass the Constitution and all the
His
precedents.
reputation was
Yeah.
built on the United States. He
Yeah.
was a Virginian, but at a certain point professionally, his reputation was built on this government and this nation being successful. And I think any decision you think he makes after the war is based on that.
Yeah. So let's back up to Boston and
Sure.
Lexington and Concord again. And Washington shows up in June to kind of start taking over. But let's give a shout out to some of your colleagues who were there with the coverage, because I do want to encourage our listeners to go back and watch the
Yeah.
videos that you guys posted. You had some great stuff
Yeah. So Mark Malloy was with us, Billy Griffith,
in
Dan.
costume or in
Well,
uniform.
so that's a funny story. Yeah, so Mark actually participated in the Battle Road demonstrations there, run by Minuteman National Park on Saturday afternoon. They actually do a tactical demonstration along Battle Road between American militia and British forces. It's very well done, and it's great to see that on the actual ground. And then he actually reenacted the Battle of Monogamy on the 20th. So yeah, he spent most of the time in his shoes. And I think he his Revolutionary War era shoes. I think he probably paid the price for that. But Mark was in costume. Billy Griffith, who's another one of our authors and historians, was there. Dan Welch, we pulled him over from the American Civil War side. We're starting to pull Kevin Pollak, Chris. I hate to tell you that. We're trying to get him on the Revolutionary
That's all
side.
right.
So
It's a
and
good time to do it. It's a good time to
right.
hop on the
It's a great
bandwagon.
time to do it. And Burt Dunkerley. Burt Dunkerley made an appearance. So, I think, we went through the whole thing together. It was great. I think our plan was really to kind of follow Paul Revere all the way out to Lexington and then do some of these historical programs they do. If you ever get a chance, April 19th or Patriots Day, to go to Lexington and see them reenact the fighting on the green, it's very well orchestrated. It's choreographed. There's all the men on the green are all representing a person, so it's not just random people. They represent a person that was there. They're dressed as they were dressed based off records. The narration is great. Everyone's mic'd up and they're saying the words that the documentation says they said on the. It's pretty amazing, and it happens as the sun comes up. And what I learned by watching it this year, I've watched it in years past, but I couldn't get close enough. I mean, we're talking 20,000 people around Little Green in New England. This year, our good friend Alex Kane, who is a fantastic historian talking about the Lexington militia on April 19th, got us VIP passes. So we got to be up front. And what they demonstrate really well to anyone is the confusion of what happened that morning. Um, if you don't know the story, the British regulars are marching to Concord looking for military supplies. They get to Lexington, and the Lexington training band, the Lexington militia, as we call it, were on the green. About 70 of them were on the green, just kind of just witnessing and watching what the regulars were going to do. And this wasn't the first time this had happened. This has happened in Salem before then. This has happened in other places where the regulars came out and the militia showed up, and but nothing happened in between. There was no firing of weapons. But on this morning, it was different. The regulars came out in the green. They told the Lexington men to disband, disarm, leave the green. Colonel Parker of the militia finally did order his men to kind of, you know, they're facing 800 trained regulars. He's got 70 guys. He's not crazy. So tells his men to disband. And the biggest controversy of April 19th is there's a shot, and no one knows. Alex Kane is researching it, but no one really knows where that shot came from. But it was a tinderbox, and that shot came from somewhere, and it lit it. And as soon as that shot goes off, the regulars fire a volley into the militiamen, and then there's all chaos breaks out. And I bring this up because the reenactment of that did a great job of showing the public that day the chaotic scene of how things can get out of control. And the regulars had no intention of getting into a fight that day. And neither did the militiamen. But it happened because they put themselves in a situation where it just took a spark. And once that happened, all hell broke loose that morning, and then it continued on in Concord. So, yeah, I'm kind of forget the question you asked me there, Chris,
Yeah,
but
no.
but I hadn't talked about Lexington much, so I figured I should talk
Yeah.
about what actually happened that day. And we all were there for it, and like I said, we continued on to Concord, and the bloodiest part of April 19th, for those who don't know, isn't Lexington Green, isn't the North Bridge of Concord. It's when the regulars decide they have to get out of Concord and retreat back to Boston. And by the time that happens, midday of April 19th, thousands of militiamen from towns and counties all over Massachusetts and into New Hampshire and into Connecticut are starting to show up. And they're getting word that the regulars have burned Concord. They have murdered, and they have, blood has been shed. Part of that's true. Blood was shed. But the tinderbox was lit, and when you're fighting a fire, you just can't put, it's hard to put out, and then it just became a very savage affair from Concord all the way back to Boston. These regulars had been up since the night before. We were trying to replicate the time that they were up. We didn't hike the whole thing, and we definitely didn't get shot at, so we don't have it as bad as those guys did from in those regular forces. But the savagery that happens to them on the way back to Boston is just it's crazy how it just shows how things can get out of control when there's a spark.
And what I've always found remarkable about that is the British, I mean, really, it's their discipline and their training that I think helps them survive that ordeal because they don't break and run and flee in a panicked rout. They hold their formation, which allows them to protect themselves as they march back. Tell us a little bit about that because there's some really interesting tactics they use, interesting guerrilla tactics that the militia use.
Right.
Super confusing.
So I think they don't flee and run because by staying together they have a better chance of surviving. Um, yeah. So one thing, there's a lot of myths that surround April 19th. And one of the myths is Great Britain, the British soldiers weren't trained or used to fighting in these wooded areas, hills, and the French Indian War tactics. That's not true. They fought in the French Indian War. Great Britain fought many wars on areas that were wooded and hill. They didn't always fight on golf courses, right? So that's not totally true. But what is true on this day is they were fighting against men who knew the area, knew the countryside, they knew the landscape that the Brits were marching through, and that gave them obviously they knew the hills, right? They knew the rock outcroppings, like at Parker's Revenge there off Battle Road. They knew places that they could take up, fire quickly, and a lot of times the militia would show up, they would do a volley, maybe two volleys, scamper back, go down farther, come back. It was a constant rotating thing. And the British troops did the right thing. They had flankers out in many locations. You have your main column and you have your flankers out to kind of wipe away that. But these guys were tired. I mean, they were supposed to be out in Concord by sunrise. Okay. They're in Lexington by sunrise. They're like 2 hours behind schedule. And the force of 800 that was sent initially was just too small. It was a lot of just everything that could have gone wrong that morning for General Gage, who was the overall command in Boston, and Francis Smith, who was the command of the column, went wrong. Everything went wrong that could have gone wrong. Um, and you're right, the British regulars are well trained, but keep in mind, a lot of these soldiers had never seen combat, and they're 20 some years, they're young, right? I mean, and they've been in Boston, and they've been harassed by the residents of Boston. Every time they go out on an excursion, there's militia with guns in their hands. That's a very unnerving thing for anyone, especially for someone that's very young, right, and untrained. Um,
I
and
think the best way to replicate that today is if you walk through downtown Boston with a Yankees hat on, you'll get heckled and harassed. Same kind of feeling.
Billy thought about doing that. We convinced him not to do that. But yeah, the tactics, the regulars cannot fight in their line of battle tactics because of the nature of the ground and the fact that they're not trying to get into a major fight. They're just trying to get back to Boston. Um, they're not trying to win a major battle. They're trying to it's just it's a retreat maneuver basically. And they perform that pretty well. But once they get, I'll say this real quick, Chris. Things are pretty for the British soldiers are getting shot at from Concord to Lexington on the way back. A relief column shows up from Boston under Lord Percy. Gage almost immediately recognizes that his secret plan on April 19th is not secret anymore. British officers see the two lanterns in Old North Church. They know there's riders out, and Gage gets a little nervous. So almost immediately he sends a relief column out. And that relief column arrives in Lexington as that original column comes back to Lexington from Concord. So they recoup for a little bit. But Percy sets up these two cannon there in Lexington on the hill to kind of scare off the militia that's forming all over the hillsides around Lexington. And he shells the meeting house. And in the meeting house are the eight dead the dead from the morning. They're laid out in the meeting house. And he shells the meeting house. And that's a different level, right? Now,
Yeah.
now it's becoming very personal. And as these troops start getting closer to Boston, there's less large farms or more small farms. There's more houses along the road. And these American militiamen are using the houses to shoot at, much like Fredericksburg, right? Using the Civil War analogy, are using the buildings to fire on the column. And then at that point, the regulars start burning houses. And now you can see now it's going to get out of hand because now they're burning houses. People are being butchered. It's very savage, and I think a lot of that starts when they shell that meeting house in Lexington, and the regulars are doing what they're taught. Your enemy force is using the buildings along the road, your retreat route for cover. You take those buildings out.
Yeah.
Um, and if you weren't on one side or the other in the morning of April 19th, most people that lived around Boston after the 19th were on the Patriot side because of what had happened there along that road.
Wow, wow. One thing we sort of skipped over is the encounter at the North Bridge. And what was it like for you to be there and see the recreation of really kind of one of those seminal moments of American history?
Right. And for those who don't know, there's a big competition rivalry between Lexington and Concord. Big time. It really starts when Lafayette comes to visit. You know, Lafayette goes to Northbridge and then comes to Lexington and says the war started here. And then from then on, both sides are, and then of course you got Emerson's famous poem, "Shot Heard Around the World." He's talking about Concord. He's not talking about the shots at Lexington. So there's a lot of competition between these two towns when it comes to April 19th. Um,
And Emerson being from Concord, we should kind
right,
of
let me growing up
obviously.
right near Northbridge there. Emerson's writing about the fight at Northbridge because that's where the American forces, the militias, I should say, I'm calling them American. They knew themselves as Massachusetts men at the time. that militia force there at Northbridge actually fires on the British regulars. Where at Lexington, it's very sporadic. They're trying to get off the green. They fire a few shots, not many, and skedaddle. At the North Bridge, the militia are firing on the regulars. They're standing up they're standing up to the king and the parliament, so to speak. So I think when Emerson writes about shot heard around the world, it's when the American colonies finally stood up to Great Britain. Um, but Northbridge is a great spot. The only issue you have if you go to Concord and Northbridge on the anniversary during Patriots Day weekend is they have a very large parade that goes through town and it goes over Northbridge. So that's all closed off at a certain point. So what we did was we finished Lexington Green. It was all shuttle buses this weekend. It usually is for the anniversary. We shuttled all the way to Concord. We hooked it from the shuttle bus stop to the bridge. I think we did one video from the bridge, and then we got out of the way because the parade came. I mean, the parade goes right. The governor was there, so they had security. So the thing with Northbridge is, to me, it's a very inspiring location when you're there by yourself or there on an
Yeah.
off day. But if you go on April 19th, it's a circus. Because there's a parade, there's speechifying, there's the governor, there's all kinds of things going on. So as a history person, you want to go there and kind of just be in the moment, right? And take it all in. It's hard to do that. And I think that was one thing I'd seen that before years past, but I think that was the one thing that my colleagues who hadn't been before, they were like, wow, this is not like Lexington. It's like, no, it's different because they use that bridge as part of the parade and part of all their ceremonies. So it's kind of hard to get that vibe you would get. But on the other days when it's not crazy there, Northbridge to me is the best spot.
Yeah.
Just to see that you got the 1830s monument that was put up, in the 1830s, way before the American Civil War. I always look at these monuments and go, what was before the Civil War? What was after the Civil War? And then you have the famous Minuteman Monument there from the 1870s that's got the farmer with the plow, at his feet. Um, and I think that spot is very inspiring when you think about what the militia and the Minutemen did there at Northbridge, taking on the regular force because they thought the town was being burned. There was smoke coming up from Concord because the British were burning tent supplies they had found that the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which was kind of an illegal political body at the time, was collecting all these supplies. They burned the tents, and some lady's house caught on fire, not because of the British, and the British regulars actually helped put the fire out, but the colonists up on the hill behind Northbridge saw these fires coming up, and someone said, "You're going to let them burn the town?" And Isaac Davis, who's in command of the active Minutemen, said, let's go. And that's how things took place at the North Bridge. But it's just hard to enjoy that. And I guess enjoy is the wrong term talking about warfare, but to really be in, kind of in that space on the actual anniversary because it is just so crazy down there.
Yeah. Hard to appreciate that with the hubbub and stuff.
There's a lot of
There's
hubbub, man. There's a block party in downtown Concord, which was great because we needed food. I mean, I don't even know, we were eating like hamburgers for breakfast because, we've been up for 30 hours, but they have a block party downtown. All the streets are closed off. Monday was a holiday there too. So it's like I said, when we started, it's a really kind of a big homecoming for both those towns.
Yeah. Now, there's also a monument there to the British soldiers who were slain at that
Right.
encounter, which might or might not make sense to people depending on how well they understand their history and
Right.
the echoes of that. What sense do you make of that monument?
I think it shows, and we see this in the American Civil War. We see this in a lot of different wars. It shows after tensions, after warfare, these veterans at some point, not all, I don't want to say all veterans, but a lot of veterans find commonality with their enemy and a kind of a mutual respect. And keep in mind, the Massachusetts men, even on April 20th, saw themselves as British, right?
Yeah.
They believed they were fighting for their legal British rights as British citizens. They haven't, I mean, some like Samuel Adams, he's ready to roll on the independence thing, but most of them aren't there, even after bloodshed, they're not there yet. So I don't think you see that deep hatred for the British that you would expect. So all along Battle Road, you'll see markers for where most of them have been removed, but they marked where British graves were located because the regulars, when the British troops are marching out, anyone that's wounded, more badly wounded or mortally wounded or killed outright, they leave behind. They can't they don't have the time, the effort, or the resources to bring these guys. And you stand there at the North Bridge, you see the monument, and to the left, when you're on the east side of the bridge, to the left, as you said, is that little monument to those British soldiers who were buried there. The thing that I think about is how far away from home these guys were. And most like in most wars, you know, the frontline soldiers don't necessarily have a role to play in why the war is going on. They're just doing their duty. And you had these, I can't say what these British soldiers thought about American liberty or the tax on tea or any of that, but they didn't make it home. And their families back home probably never knew what happened to them. They knew they died on April 19th, but didn't know where they laid. So I think that's a poignant spot. And it's very nice to see there's British flags put at all these markers along Battle Road. Um, we were going to put up American flags, but we decided, these men that fought wouldn't have recognized it.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, we usually put the Betsy Ross flag down, but these men on April 19th uh, wouldn't have recognized that flag at all. And
Yeah. That didn't
so,
exist yet.
but yeah, thank you for bringing up the British monument there because it is cool to kind of take in how they were respected later on. And like I said, my thought is always about how far away from home are they,
Yeah.
and probably didn't really want to be there, right? So it's kind of a sad little spot to be in, but it kind of reminds you of how horrible warfare can be.
Yeah. How would you assess Minuteman National Park's handling of the commemoration? I mean, lots going on. I know they drew people in from all over the place.
Right.
Big deal.
There's a lot of people. They do a tactical, I don't want to say battle, a tactical demonstration. National Park Service doesn't do opposing fire or, you know, they don't show wounded or casualties. They do that every year, and it's always well done when they do it. The park, for those who've been up there last year, most of the park, the Battle Road, was closed during the last 8 months, 10 months because they redid a lot of Battle Road. They redid the North Bridge, so there's a lot of infrastructure that the park did to get ready for the 250th. And so the park was great. It's one of my favorite parks to go to. Um, you know, it's always hard when you bring thousands and thousands and thousands of people to an event. The buses, they had buses everywhere, not always well timed, but having done something similar to that during the Battle of First Bull Run's anniversary back in 2011, I know how hard that is to pull off. And all the roads were closed, right? The only thing that I didn't like about it was for most of the day on April 19th, you couldn't just walk Battle Road. You couldn't just go through the park. Phil Greenwalt and I, who wrote a book about Lexington and Concord, we did that a couple years ago. We started on one and we just walked the whole road and just took it all in. You
Yeah.
couldn't do that because
Yeah.
they were afraid of the crowds. There was not enough parking for people to
Yeah.
do that. So that was the one thing that was kind of a downfall by having a huge event is you can't really enjoy the park as you would usually enjoy the park. But that's just a necessary evil because of the fact there were so many people there.
Yeah.
There are people from
I
all
was
over
thinking
the
about this.
country.
I was thinking about the same thing with Old North Church,
Right.
the night before, where it's in a really crowded section of North End, and so
Yeah.
just the logistics of moving so many people through that area for that commemoration must have been a huge logistical nightmare.
Yeah, and what was amazing, and I'll say the same thing about the Boston Tea Party anniversary that we were also at in 2023. Um, the coordination in the city was amazing. Just like it was for the 2023 commemoration of the Tea Party. They had something at Paul Revere House that moved to Old North, that moved to the Charles River. They had a guy rowing across the Charles River like Paul Revere did. They had a drone show. It's on my first drone show which I was like, I don't want to see that. It was actually pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then they had events in Charlestown. They were all coordinated so you can actually flow with it all. That was very well done. I mean, and there was thousands of people. People turned out. Again, like I said at the beginning, it is a historic date, something that a lot of us who are involved in history really enjoy because of its historical nature. But for Boston and the communities, Lexington and Concord, it's Patriots Day weekend. It is kind of like a homecoming weekend. And some of us in our group didn't like that nature of it, but I think it's great. I think if it gets kids interested in what happens on April 19th because they know it's a fun weekend, I'm all in for it. I think
Yeah.
as historians, we're always trying to find ways to engage people, especially people that aren't usually interested in these things. And I think, I do agree there needs to be some reverence for what's going on because people are dying, historically speaking, and you have to honor that. But the fact that people look forward to this weekend because they know that's kind of like a homecoming weekend, I think it's a great thing for us to kind of tap into when we're talking about the American Revolution. And I think it ties into that thing you said at the beginning where, a lot of people in this country look at it and can get behind it. And I think some of it has to draw out of what Boston and Philadelphia is the same way around the 4th of July. 4th of July in Philly is a big deal.
Yeah, yeah,
We'll
yeah.
be there next July 4th. It will be a big deal then. So you just don't see that in the southern reservoir sites. But in Philly and Boston, it's a big deal.
Yeah, Boston's a city that really knows how to do its history up, I think,
It does. It does.
Yeah.
And for the traffic that it has, it's got a lot of traffic. But you can walk the historic part of that city. I'm pretty much the most out of shape person out there. And you can walk that city, the historic part, pretty easily and get to one side to the other. It's
Yeah.
all laid out. It's well marked. The Freedom Trail is fantastic. So it's a great place to kind of enjoy that history.
Now, if people are feeling bad because, oh gosh, now I'm hearing all this, it sounded cool. I wish I'd been there. There's another chance because the Bunker Hill anniversary will be coming up soon.
Yep.
So if folks do decide they want to go and participate and walk in the footsteps, what would you recommend they go and see?
For Bunker Hill, you go to Bunker Hill, the national park. There has a small park in the Bunker Hill Monument, which is a great site. There's a reenactment the weekend after the anniversary that I think Mark Malloy will be going up there. I know no one is surprised by that.
Yeah, right.
Um, and so I think Bunker Hill is a great site, even though it's all been built over. Unfortunately, it's hard to grasp what happened at Bunker Hill. But Bunker Hill is the bloodiest battle of the American Revolution. I mean, people just kind of forget about that.
Wow.
Um, but the park there for what they have is great. The visitor centers there are great. If you're in Charlestown, highly recommend Warren Tavern, which was not there during the Revolution, but it was built in 1780. The British burned Charlestown during Bunker Hill because they were Massachusetts forces using the buildings and they just burned the whole town. Warren Tavern was built right after that. George Washington visited Warren Tavern. It's a great historic spot to grab a drink or even dinner. But I would definitely check out the Bunker Hill Monument. You definitely have to see that when you're in Boston if you're interested in the Battle of Bunker Hill.
Very good. And Washington's headquarters, which had been also home for Henry
Oh yeah.
Wadsworth Longfellow, that's a good
Over
place
there in
to
Cambridge,
visit.
that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many things to see in Boston. I think that's the one thing I'd done it before, but I think a lot of my colleagues hadn't done some of these things before. Everything is marked. Like there's monuments, there's little markers where you can follow Revere from Boston out to Lexington. There's sites where marked where George Washington took command of the army. There's things everywhere, and it's well marked. And one thing it's missing, I was saying this to someone who's a historian in Boston, is there's no, I have a book about Lexington and Concord, but there's no really book that has all of these things in them, and even some of the websites that we use to find these markers and plaques doesn't have everything. And I think
Right.
I think the reason why there's not a book is because it'd just be impossible to get it done because there's so much out there. There's markers and plaques everywhere in Boston that relate to the American Revolution. So maybe a future project, Chris, we could do that.
We'll get to work on it. We'll get to work on it.
Yeah, but
Uh,
no, we do have it. Emerging Revolutionary War does have a book coming out about Bunker Hill, by Phil Greenwalt and Daniel Davis. So hopefully that will have some of that stuff in there about Boston's Revolutionary War history because it is very broad and diverse.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll give a shout out to the Adams site down in Quincy. Just my homeboy John Adams down
John
there.
Adams. I know you got to do the
Yeah,
John
I
Adams
gotta get
thing.
him. I gotta
Yeah,
get
I mean,
him.
and yeah, you're right. There's a lot of national park properties there in Boston. John Adams, obviously. But if you go to the area and you have to see maybe two or three things, definitely see Lexington, see Northbridge. And then my other one would be to see the Boston Tea Party Ship Museum downtown.
Yeah,
It's
that
a
ship museum's
real
fantastic.
nice little museum. It's near the location of the Tea Party, but to me, the revolutionary movement begins at the Tea Party.
Yeah. Yeah. Rob, I've enjoyed a chance to visit Lexington and Concord vicariously through your adventures. If folks want to watch the videos, and you've had millions, literally millions of people watch your
We
videos. They
did. We
went
went
viral.
viral on our Paul
Yeah.
Revere. We were watching that all night long, and it hit like 3 some million, and it was yeah crazy. I'm
So
not sure how that happened. Gary Edelman shared some of our videos, and things took off, and then it hit millions. And so I have to give my shout out and kudos to Gary for helping us get the word out on that. But yeah, the videos I'm putting them up on YouTube right now, actually. So we'll have them on YouTube because they're on Facebook now, and Facebook only keeps those videos for so long. So
right.
we'll create a playlist on our YouTube channel.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations on a job well done.
Thank you.
Yes. I'm Chris Mikowski for Rob Orrison. Thanks for being with us today on the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.